In the golden glow of childhood memory, a name echoes that shaped how generations learned to dream. Walt Disney built an empire from ink and imagination, transforming simple drawings into a cultural force that would touch nearly every corner of the modern world. His creations became the wallpaper of youth, the soundtrack of innocence, the architecture of family ritual. To understand the 20th century's relationship with storytelling, entertainment, and the commodification of wonder itself, you must first understand the man who made magic into a merchandise category. He rose from Midwestern poverty, from dawn paper routes and bankruptcy twice over before 30, carrying with him both a genuine gift for narrative and an iron determination never to be powerless again. What began as sketches sold for pennies became an animation studio, then a merchandising machine, then a physical kingdom in California where childhood could be walked through, purchased, and remembered. He pioneered synchronized sound in animation, proved that cartoons could move audiences to tears, and convinced America that a theme park could be cleaner, safer, more controlled than the carnival. In doing so, he became Uncle Walt, the cardigan-wearing guardian of family values, broadcast into living rooms, trusted implicitly by millions. Yet beneath the warmth lay colder truths. Workers who struck for fair wages found themselves denounced and cast out. Artists who built his vision discovered their names erased beneath his singular credit. He informed on colleagues to federal agents, testified before congressional committees about communist threats, and constructed a corporate architecture designed to ensure no one could ever take from him what he believed was his. The control that saved him from creditors became the control that defined every relationship, every contract, every square foot of his kingdoms. This is the story of Walter Elias Disney, dreamer and tyrant, innovator and informant, the man who taught the world to wish upon a star while building an empire that would never let that star slip from his grasp. Welcome to Richie Rich Stories. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video with your circle, and let us know where you are from, what time it is now, and how you feel today in the comments below. Now pick your sweetest spot and enjoy tonight's story. This audiobook is based on true stories, but some events, characters, places, and conversations are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. I was born on December 5th, 1901, in a cramped Chicago tenement that smelled of cabbage and coal smoke. The Hermosa neighborhood wasn't much to look at. Wooden houses pressed together like matchsticks. Immigrant families squeezed into rooms that barely fit their dreams. My father, Elias, had hands like tree bark from his carpentry work, rough hands that built things, fixed things, disciplined things. My mother, Flora, spoke in whispers most days, her voice soft as flower dust from her teaching years. Chicago was loud then. Horse hooves on cobblestones, factory whistles at dawn, the elevated train that rattled our windows and made my baby sister Ruth cry. The stockyards sent their smell clear across the south side on hot days, blood and money mixed together in a way that made grown men either rich or broken. I learned early that the difference between those two things was thinner than most folks cared to admit. Elias believed in work the way other men believed in God, maybe more. He'd wake before sunrise, oil his tools with the same reverence Flora used for her evening prayers. But work betrayed him sometimes. Contracts dried up, payment came late, and I'd watch him pace our 3 rooms like a caged animal. Those were the nights he'd lecture us about discipline and moral fiber, his Irish accent thickening with frustration. "A man who doesn't work," he'd say, pointing that gnarled finger at us boys, "isn't a man at all." My brother Roy, 8 years older, seemed to understand this arithmetic better than I did. Herbert and Raymond, too, though they kept their distance from the old man's moods. I was closer to Ruth than any of them, really. She'd watch me draw on scraps of paper with wonder in her eyes, like I was performing magic instead of just scratching lines with a stub of pencil. Drawing came to me natural as breathing. I'd sketch the neighborhood cats, the delivery horses, the pigeons that nested in our eaves. Flora would save her teaching paper for me when she could, though Elias grumbled about waste. But even he couldn't argue when Mrs. Kowalski next door offered me a nickel for a picture of her tabby cat. Real money for something I'd do anyway. Maybe the boys got something that evening, Flora smoothing my hair as Elias counted his carpentry earnings at the kitchen table. He grunted, didn't look up from his coins. By 1906, Chicago's noise had worn us thin. Elias made a decision that changed everything. We'd try farming. He'd bought land sight unseen in Marceline, Missouri, convinced that country air and honest soil would straighten out whatever was crooked in our family's luck. I was 5 when we loaded our belongings into a wagon and headed west. The train ride felt like traveling to another planet. Chicago's smoke gave way to endless fields, the city's brick and iron replaced by wooden farmhouses scattered across rolling hills like toys a child had forgotten. Marceline was tiny, maybe 2,000 souls, dirt streets that turned to mud when it rained, and more animals than I'd ever seen in one place. Our farm sat on 45 acres outside town. The house was bigger than our Chicago rooms, but colder somehow, drafty and creaking in ways that made nighttime feel dangerous. Elias threw himself into farming with the same grim determination he'd shown his carpentry, but the land fought back harder than lumber ever did. Crops failed, animals got sick, money stayed scarce. I found my escape in the barn. Mice lived in the hay, bold little creatures that didn't mind sharing space with a dreaming boy. I'd sit for hours watching them, sketching their quick movements and bright eyes. They seemed happier than any humans I knew, free to come and go, no bills to pay, no father's disappointment to carry. Mrs. Sherman, who lived nearest to town, was the first to buy one of my animal drawings. I'd walked to her place with a picture of her cow, Clara, drawn on brown paper I'd begged from Flora. The woman studied it like she was examining fine art. "Well, I'll be," she said. "You've got Clara's stubborn expression just right." She pressed a dime into my palm. "That's better than most photographs." Word spread the way it does in small places. Soon I had neighbors asking for pictures of their livestock, their hunting dogs, even their children. 10 cents here, 5 cents there. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Money earned from something I loved doing. Elias took most of it, claimed it for household expenses, but I kept enough hidden to buy penny candy and sometimes paper of my own. The work was harder than Chicago. Dawn milking, feeding chickens, mucking stalls. Elias drove us like we were hired hands instead of his children. Roy took it better than I did. He was older, stronger, already thinking about escape. But I was still small enough that the animals fascinated me more than the labor discouraged me. "You're building character," Elias would say when I complained about the cold morning chores. What I was really building was a catalog of textures and smells and sounds that would stay with me forever. the way morning mist hung over the cornfield, how a horse's breath steamed in winter air, the particular quality of silence on a farm at midnight, not empty, but full of sleeping life. Flora understood my drawing better than Elias did. She'd find me sketching by lamplight after chores and sit beside me without speaking. Sometimes she'd hum old teaching songs, melodies that seemed to help my pencil move smoother across the paper. She never asked me to stop, never worried about wasted time or materials the way her husband did. "Art is a gift," she told me once, while I drew a picture of our rooster. "God gives different gifts to different people." Elias overheard. "God helps those who help themselves," he said, not looking up from his ledger. "Always counting, always figuring, always finding the numbers coming up short." The neighbors in Marceline were different from city folks. Kinder, maybe, or just less pressed by city pressures. They had time to stop and talk when they passed our fence, time to admire a child's drawing without hurrying on to the next obligation. Mrs. Patterson bought pictures for her grandchildren in Kansas City. Mr. Hendricks commissioned a portrait of his prize bull. Even the preacher, Reverend Morrison, asked me to draw the church building for their Easter program. I was getting better, too. Practice and observation sharpened my eye. I learned how light fell differently on fur than on feathers, how to capture the particular way a pig's ears folded or a cat's tail curved. The animals became characters to me, each with their own personality that I tried to capture in my drawings. But Elias grew more frustrated as the pieces passed. Farming demanded money we didn't have, for seed, for equipment, for repairs that never seemed to end. I'd hear him and Flora talking in low voices after they thought us children were asleep, about debt, about moving again, about whether city life might have been better after all. "The boy's art nonsense isn't helping anything," he said one night. "It's not nonsense," Flora replied, quiet but firm. "He has talent." "Talent doesn't pay bills." Maybe not, but it was the only thing in that house that felt entirely mine. When I held a pencil and watched an animal long enough to understand its essence, then transferred that understanding to paper, that was mine in a way nothing else was, not subject to crop failure or market prices or a father's approval. The money I earned from drawings might have been pocket change to adults, but it taught me something important. People would pay for things that made them feel good. A picture of their beloved cow or favorite dog wasn't just paper and pencil marks. It was affection made visible. It was proof that someone had looked closely enough to see what made that animal special. By my 9th birthday, I'd saved enough hidden coins to buy a set of colored pencils from the general store in town, real artist's tools, not just stubbed lead. The day I brought them home, Flora's face lit up like Christmas morning. Elias saw them too. His expression was harder to read. "How much did those cost?" he asked. $1.15, I said, trying to keep pride out of my voice. He was quiet for a long moment, calculating something in his head. Finally, he nodded. "Your money, I suppose." It was the closest thing to approval I'd gotten from him about my drawing. Small praise, but I held on to it like those precious colored pencils. The farm taught me about cycles, planting and harvesting, birth and death, lean months and plenty. But mostly it taught me about watching, really watching, the way animals moved, how weather changed the light, what made one day different from another even when the chores stayed the same. That skill, that patience for observation, would serve me longer than any crop we planted in Missouri soil. As 1910 approached, I could feel change coming again. Elias's frustration with farming was reaching a breaking point, and Flora's gentle suggestions about returning to city life were becoming less gentle. Roy was talking about his own future, separate from family plans. Even at 8 years old, I understood that our Marceline chapter was ending. But something had taken root in me during those farm years. Not just drawing ability, but an understanding that imagination could be currency if you knew how to spend it. That people would pay for things that made them happy, made them remember, made them feel connected to something beautiful. The animals I drew for neighbors weren't just pictures, they were small pieces of joy, worth 5 or 10 cents each. I didn't know then that I was learning the fundamental business of my life, that someday I'd build an empire on the simple principle that happiness was the most valuable commodity you could sell. All I knew was that when Mrs. Sherman smiled at a drawing of Clara the cow, she was buying something more precious than beef or milk. She was buying a little bit of wonder, and I was the one selling it. The paper route started when I was 10, 3:30 in the morning, every morning, dragging myself from the warm cocoon of blankets into Kansas City's bitter pre-dawn darkness. My father had arranged it, another lesson in what he called building character, though I suspected it was more about the $15 a month the Kansas City Times paid me. Most of that money never made it to my pocket anyway. Elias had his own ideas where a boy's earnings belonged. I'd stumble through our kitchen, grab yesterday's leftover coffee gone cold, and step into streets that belonged more to cats and drunks than to children. The bundles of newspapers waited at the depot, tied with rough twine that cut my fingers even through wool mittens. Each paper weighed nothing alone, but loaded into my canvas sack, they became an anchor that pulled at my shoulder for the next 3 hours. Winter mornings were the worst. Snow turned to ice under wagon wheels, and the wind off the Missouri River could freeze spit before it hit the ground. I learned to move fast, not just to finish the route, but to keep blood flowing to my feet. The wealthy neighborhoods on Quality Hill got their papers tucked neatly behind storm doors. The South Side tenements, where families like mine scraped by, those papers got wedged wherever they'd stayed dry. But something else happened during those dark hours. The city revealed different faces than it wore in daylight. I'd catch glimpses through windows, families gathered around kitchen tables, mothers rocking babies, men hunched over ledgers by lamplight. Each house contained a story, and I found myself inventing narratives for the people inside. The widow on Armour Boulevard who always left her porch light burning, the banker's family on Ward Parkway whose cook was already preparing breakfast at 4 in the morning. These fragments of other lives became more interesting than my own. The route took me past the Orpheum Theater, and that's where everything changed. Not immediately. Change rarely announces itself that clearly. But on nights when vaudeville ran late, I'd see the last stragglers emerging, their faces still bright with whatever they'd witnessed inside. Sometimes the stage door would crack open as I passed, spilling golden light and the tail end of music into the street. One morning, emboldened by curiosity and the strange license that darkness provides, I peered through the lobby windows. Inside, posters advertised acts I couldn't yet afford to see, comedians, dancers, something called moving pictures. The images were crude by later standards, but they promised worlds beyond Kansas City's stockyards and muddy streets. I started spending my nickels, the few Elias allowed me to keep, on tickets to the afternoon picture shows. The Keystone Cops taught me that chaos could be choreographed, Charlie Chaplin showed me how a raised eyebrow could carry more weight than a shouted line. These weren't just entertainments, they were lessons in a language I was only beginning to understand. Every pratfall was precisely timed, every gesture served the story. I'd watch the same reel multiple times, studying how the comedians built tension and released it. My father didn't understand this fascination. To him, the theater was frivolity, a waste of time and money that could be better spent on practical concerns. But I found something there that the paper route and our cramped house couldn't provide. Proof that ordinary people could be transformed into something magical, even if only for 20 minutes in a darkened room. The drawing came naturally, probably too naturally for my own good. I'd sketch faces I'd glimpsed on my route, trying to capture the stories I'd invented for them. Margins of school books filled with characters, mostly animals, because they seemed more honest than people. A dog couldn't lie about its intentions. A mouse revealed its personality in the way it held its tail. When my family moved to Chicago in 1917, I thought the drawings might stay buried in Kansas City soil. But McKinley High School on the west side proved to be just another version of the same restlessness I'd felt carrying newspapers. The classes felt disconnected from anything that mattered. History was memorization, mathematics was repetition. But art was possibility. The Chicago Academy of Fine Arts held night classes in a building that smelled of turpentine and ambition. Working men and women came there after their regular jobs, carrying portfolios and dreams they couldn't quite articulate. I enrolled with money earned from weekend jobs, telling my parents it was vocational training, which, in a sense, it was. The first night, I climbed 3 flights of stairs to a room where easels stood like sentinels under harsh electric lights. The instructor, a thin man named Morrison, who wore paint under his fingernails like other men wore wedding rings, examined our work with the casual brutality of experience. He held up my sketch of a streetcar conductor, just something I'd drawn while riding to school, and studied it for what felt like an hour. The room went quiet. Other students leaned forward, waiting for judgment. "This has something," Morrison said, finally. "Not technique, you need work there, but timing. You understand when to stop." Those words hit me harder than any praise I'd received for memorizing multiplication tables or delivering newspapers without complaint. Here was an adult who dealt professionally with images, telling me I possessed something worth developing. That night, walking home through Chicago's electric-lit streets, I felt different. Not just like a kid who could draw, but like someone whose drawing might matter to people beyond myself. The classes became my real education. We studied poster design, commercial illustration, the emerging field of advertising art. These weren't fine artists creating beauty for its own sake. They were craftsmen solving problems with pictures. How do you sell soap? How do you make a face memorable? How do you tell a story in a single image? I practiced constantly, sketching passengers on the streetcar, copying advertisements from newspapers, trying to understand why certain faces stuck in memory while others vanished. The work felt less like schooling than like preparing for something I couldn't yet name. Then the war came calling, or I went calling on it. The specifics hardly matter now. What mattered was the lie I told about my age and the Red Cross ambulance corps that would take a 16-year-old who claimed to be 17. My parents signed the papers, probably relieved to have one less mouth to feed during wartime rationing. The training camp taught me to drive, to maintain engines, to follow orders without question. But mostly it taught me to wait. The Army runs on waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for transport, waiting for permission to act. I filled the hours sketching my fellow volunteers, trying to capture the particular boredom that comes with knowing you're supposed to be part of something important without understanding what that something actually is. By the time we shipped to France, the armistice had been signed. The war was over, but the aftermath remained. I arrived to find a country that looked like what happens after God loses his temper. Villages reduced to rubble and memories, churches with their spires blown away, trees stripped of bark and leaves standing like accusations against the sky. Our job was cleanup, moving wounded soldiers who were stable enough to travel, maintaining equipment, trying to restore some version of normal function to a landscape that had forgotten what normal meant. It wasn't heroic work, but it was necessary work, and I learned the difference between those two things. Paris, when we got leave, was another education entirely. The city had survived the war with its beauty intact, but something in its spirit had shifted. People moved faster, laughed harder, drank more deliberately. There was a sense that time itself had become unreliable, that you better squeeze experience from every moment because tomorrow might bring another catastrophe. I spent my francs in the museums and cafes, studying how French artists approached the same problems I'd been wrestling with in Chicago. Toulouse-Lautrec's posters showed how simple lines could capture complex personalities. The cartoonists in the daily papers proved that humor could carry political weight. These weren't lessons you could learn from textbooks. They required seeing the original work, understanding how it functioned in its intended context. But the real education came from my fellow ambulance drivers. These were college men, mostly, from families that could afford to send their sons to war as volunteers rather than draftees. They spoke casually about opportunities waiting for them back home, jobs in their father's businesses, graduate studies, social connections that would open doors I'd never even noticed existed. I listened more than I spoke during those conversations around our evening fires. These men took for granted access to worlds that seemed impossible from my perspective, but they also revealed something useful. Success wasn't just about talent or hard work, though both mattered. It was about understanding how systems functioned, where the leverage points were hidden, which people had the power to say yes. The return voyage gave me weeks to think about what I'd learned and what I wanted to do with it. The boy who'd left Chicago knew how to draw. The young man coming back understood that drawing was just one tool in a larger kit. The real skill was in knowing which tool to use, when, and for whom. America in 1919 felt different than the country I'd left. Faster somehow, more impatient with old certainties. The war had shuffled the deck in ways that wouldn't become clear for years, but you could sense the change in how people talked about the future. Anything seemed possible, which was either thrilling or terrifying, depending on how much you had to lose. I had nothing to lose, which felt like an advantage. The paper route years had taught me to work when others slept. Chicago night school had shown me that skill could be learned if you wanted it badly enough. France had proved that the world was larger and more complex than Kansas City had suggested, but also that it was navigable if you paid attention and kept moving forward. Standing on the dock in New York Harbor, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from morning fog, I felt ready for whatever came next. Not because I had a plan. I was 19 years old and barely qualified to tie my own shoes, but because I'd learned to see opportunities in unlikely places and to persist when persistence seemed pointless. The war had ended, but my real education was just beginning. Those pre-dawn paper routes, those night classes, those months cleaning up after humanity's capacity for destruction, they'd all been preparation for something larger. I just didn't know what yet. The partnership with UB lasted exactly 1 month. 1 month of sitting in a cramped office above a barber shop on Forest Avenue,
waiting for clients who never came, watching our modest savings evaporate like morning frost. I'd met Ub at Kansas City Film Ad Company, both of us young, both convinced we could do better on our own. We scraped together $40 to rent that office space and painted iWorks and Disney commercial artists on the frosted glass door in careful block letters. I remember the smell of that place, hair tonic drifting up from below, old wood, and the faint chemical tang of the mimeograph machine we'd bought second-hand. Ub would sit at his drawing board, sketching perfect lines with that mechanical precision of his, while I'd pace the narrow space between our two desks, dreaming up campaigns for businesses that didn't know we existed. The barbershop customers below us got haircuts. We got creditors. When Kansas City Film Ad offered us steady work, $40 a week each, we folded our little venture faster than a bad poker hand. Pride's expensive when you're eating crackers for dinner.
Those early mornings at the film company changed everything for me. The building sat on a corner downtown, all brick and optimism, humming with the industrial energy that defined Kansas City in those days. The city was riding high on agricultural prosperity, grain elevators reaching toward the sky like steel prayers, the stockyards churning with commerce. But beneath that boom, you could sense the tremor of uncertainty. The 1920 recession had rattled folks, and Prohibition had driven the liquor trade underground, creating a shadow economy that touched everything. I learned cutout animation in those cramped studio rooms, hunched over light tables that threw harsh shadows across our faces. The process was primitive, cutting paper figures, positioning them frame by frame under a camera borrowed from the photography department. Each movement required dozens of incremental adjustments. A character's walk might take 3 hours to animate 5 seconds of footage. But I fell in love with it. The magic of making drawings move, of breathing life into ink and paper. It felt like genuine sorcery. After work, I'd carry that borrowed camera home to the garage behind my rooming house, experimenting with different techniques until my eyes burned from strain and the Kansas City winter crept through the thin walls. The garage became my laboratory. I rigged up lights using extension cords snaked through a broken window, built a makeshift animation stand from scrap lumber. Mrs. Henderson, my landlady, thought I was building bombs back there with all the strange hours and flickering lights. The neighborhood kids would peer through the gaps in the door, watching me move paper cutouts millimeter by millimeter, probably figuring I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, in a way. The work consumed me. I'd animate until 2 in the morning, then drag myself to the film company by 8, eyes red-rimmed and hands stained with ink. But those late nights taught me something crucial about the relationship between vision and craft, that dreams without technical skill remained just dreams, while technique without imagination produced nothing worth watching. The idea for Laugh-O-Gram Studios came to me during one of those garage sessions, probably around midnight on a Tuesday in early 1922. I was working on a test reel, something about modernizing fairy tales, when it hit me. Why work for someone else when I could build something of my own? The timing seemed perfect. The country was climbing out of recession, stock markets were rising, and there was money floating around Kansas City looking for opportunities. Local businessmen were flush from agricultural profits, and the entertainment business, movies, radio, even this new thing called animation, felt like the future. I rented space in the McConaughey building downtown, a proper office with decent light and room for equipment. The sign painter charged me $12 to letter Laugh-O-Gram Films on the door, money I borrowed against next month's salary, but it looked professional, official, like we meant business. Oob joined me again, along with a few other artists from around town. We were going to revolutionize fairy tales, make them modern and funny and relevant to audiences who lived in a world of automobiles and jazz music instead of castles and spinning wheels. Red Riding Hood would drive a car. Cinderella would go to a contemporary dance hall. The stories would be timeless, but the settings would pulse with 1920s energy. I put everything into those shorts. My savings, money borrowed from family, even a loan against the camera equipment. We produced 6 films: Little Red Riding Hood, The Four Musicians of Bremen, Jack and the Beanstalk, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Puss in Boots, and Cinderella. Each one better than the last, each one representing weeks of 18-hour days and nights spent fine-tuning every detail. The distributor was an outfit called Pictorial Clubs, based out of New York. They seemed legitimate: professional correspondence, references, the kind of smooth confidence that made a young entrepreneur believe he was dealing with serious people. They offered $11,000 for the complete series. $11,000. It seemed like all the money in the world. I signed that contract without a lawyer, trusting handshakes and letterhead. The fairy tale shorts were shipped east, and we waited for payment that would establish Laugh-O-Gram as a real studio, maybe even let me hire more artists, buy better equipment, dream bigger dreams. The payment never came. Pictorial Clubs declared bankruptcy sometime in the summer of 1923, leaving us holding beautifully animated films and empty bank accounts. I learned later this wasn't unusual in the distribution business: fly-by-night operators who'd take product, sell what they could, and disappear when things got complicated. But knowing it was common didn't ease the sting of betrayal or pay the rent. The collapse happened gradually, then suddenly. First, we had to let go the extra artists. Then Oob found work elsewhere: steady pay, regular hours, the kind of security Laugh-O-Gram could no longer offer. The office grew quiet, equipment gathering dust, bills piling up like autumn leaves. By midsummer, I was living in the studio, sleeping on the couch, washing my face in the public restroom down the hall. Mrs. Martinez, who ran the newsstand in the building lobby, would sometimes slip me day-old sandwiches when she thought nobody was looking. Breakfast became coffee and whatever I could afford from the automat, usually a can of beans heated on the hot plate I'd smuggled into the office. Those beans. Van Camp's pork and beans, 20 cents a can. I must have eaten 100 cans that summer, heated over a Bunsen burner while Kansas City sweltered outside the windows. The taste of them still takes me back to that period, the sweetness masking something desperate, the way you eat when food is fuel rather than pleasure. The isolation was the hardest part. Sitting in that empty office, surrounded by the remnants of a failed dream, watching the sun track across the wall while I tried to figure out what came next. The building's other tenants, insurance salesmen, accountants, a dentist who played opera records too loudly, went about their business while I haunted the halls like some sort of commercial ghost. But even then, even during the worst of it, I couldn't quite give up on the medium. I'd salvaged one thing from the wreckage: a test reel I'd shot combining live action with animation, a little girl interacting with cartoon characters. Alice's Wonderland, I'd called it, thinking maybe there was something there worth developing. The technique was crude but promising. The girl, Virginia Davis, was the daughter of one of our investors, and she had a natural ease on camera that made the fantasy elements feel believable. Watching her dance with cartoon characters, laugh at cartoon jokes, inhabit a world where anything was possible, it pointed towards something new, some synthesis of reality and imagination that might actually find an audience. During those final weeks in the studio, I'd run that Alice reel over and over on the Moviola, trying to understand what made it work. The technical problems were obvious: Lighting mismatches, registration issues, the cartoon characters sometimes floating relative to the live action. But beneath those surface flaws, something magical was happening. The barrier between the real world and the drawn world was dissolving. That's what I was thinking about when I finally admitted defeat and wired Roy in Los Angeles. My brother was out there recovering from tuberculosis at a veterans hospital, and while his health was fragile, he had some savings put away. $200 he could spare, enough for a train ticket west and a little left over to start again. The telegram office was on Main Street, next to a barber shop that reminded me uncomfortably of that first failed office above Forest Avenue. I remember standing there, composing the message in my head, trying to find words that would convey urgency without desperation. Need $200, stop, heading west, stop, have idea, stop. Roy's response came the same day. Money wired, stop, come ahead, stop. I packed everything that mattered into a cardboard suitcase, some clothes, a few drawings, and that precious Alice reel. The camera went back to the dealer I'd bought it from, though he only gave me half what I paid. The rest of the equipment I sold to another aspiring filmmaker, enough to cover my final month's rent. The train station was crowded with travelers, families, salesmen, drifters, all the restless energy of America in motion. Kansas City was shedding people in those days, young folks heading to the coasts where opportunity supposedly waited. The westbound platform buzzed with conversations about California, oil discoveries, movie studios, land deals, the promise of endless sunshine and second chances. I bought a coach ticket to Los Angeles, counting out the bills carefully, making sure I'd have enough left for meals during the 3-day journey. The train was one of the newer models, sleek and powerful, but I was riding in the cheap seats with the farmers and clerks and optimists. As we pulled away from Union Station, I watched Kansas City recede through the smudged window, the grain elevators, the stockyards, the downtown buildings where I'd learned my craft and lost my first business. The city looked smaller from the moving train, more manageable, like something you could fit in your pocket and carry with you. Somewhere in the luggage rack above my head sat that Alice reel, 24 frames per second of pure possibility. I didn't know then that it would become the foundation of everything that followed, that the little girl dancing with cartoon characters would point the way toward an empire. I only knew I had an idea, a reel of film, and a one-way ticket to a place where the sun always shone and dreams supposedly came true. The train picked up speed as we headed into the Kansas prairie, and I settled back in my seat, watching the landscape blur past. Behind me lay failure and bankruptcy and the taste of cold beans. Ahead lay, well, I'd find out soon enough what lay ahead. The garage smelled of motor oil and old wood, mixed with the sharp tang of animation chemicals. $10 a month for this cramped space behind my Uncle Robert's on Kingswell Avenue, but it was ours, mine and Roy's. I'd set up the camera on a makeshift stand, rigged lights with whatever bulbs I could scrounge, and turned the back corner into what I laughingly called our studio. Roy handled the books at a rickety card table while I hunched over my drawing board, bringing Alice to life, frame by frame. Those first months in Los Angeles felt like holding my breath underwater. We'd scraped together enough for the train fare west, arrived with $40 between us, and now we were burning through that faster than I cared to calculate. But Margaret Winkler kept ordering more Alice comedies, 1,500 per short, and somehow we made the numbers work. Roy was a wizard with the ledger, stretching every dollar until it screamed. "We clear about $7.50 per picture after costs," Roy told me one evening, squinting at his figures by lamplight. If we can keep producing one a month.
I nodded, though my mind was already elsewhere. Alice in Cartoonland was bringing in steady money, sure enough, but watching Felix the Cat shorts at the movie houses around town, I knew we were still playing in the shallow end. Pat Sullivan had something we didn't, a character people remembered, talked about, bought toys of. Alice was clever, mixing live action with animation, but she wasn't ours in the way that mattered. The city sprawled around us like a fever dream. Orange groves being bulldozed for housing developments, oil derricks pumping black gold from Wilshire Boulevard, the smell of jasmine and automobile exhaust mixing in the dry air. Hollywood Boulevard buzzed with ambition. Every drugstore soda jerk convinced he'd be the next Valentino. Every waitress sure she'd catch a producer's eye. The studios were fortresses, high walls, guarded gates, contract players shuffling between sound stages like well-dressed prisoners. We moved to proper quarters on Hyperion Avenue in 26, and I insisted we rename the operation Walt Disney Studio. Roy raised an eyebrow at that, dropping Brothers from the name, but he understood. We'd found our rhythm by then. Roy kept us solvent, I kept us dreaming. He worried about rent and payroll. I worried about whether Mickey Mouse, still just a sketch in my notebook then, could move an audience the way Felix did. That's when Charles Mintz entered our lives, smooth as silk and twice as slippery. He'd married Margaret Winkler and taken over distribution of our shorts. Mintz had that New York polish, sharp suits, manicured nails, the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. But he was paying the bills, and when he suggested we develop a new character, something with more merchandising potential, I listened. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit came to me in a burst of late-night inspiration. Long ears, button nose, that mischievous grin that suggested he was one step ahead of trouble. The first Oswald shorts did better than anything we'd produced before. Theaters were asking for more. Mintz was talking about increasing our budgets. For a few months, I let myself believe we'd cracked the code. I should have read the contracts more carefully. Roy did, of course. He always did. But I was too focused on the creative side to pay attention to the fine print. That was my mistake, and it nearly killed us. February 1928. Mintz summoned me to New York to discuss terms for the coming year. I took the train east, feeling confident, maybe even a little cocky. Oswald was drawing crowds, our animation was getting smoother, and I figured we'd earned ourselves a raise. The rails clicked beneath me as America rolled past, wheat fields giving way to industrial cities, smokestacks and steel mills, the whole country humming with prosperity.
Mintz's office overlooked Broadway, all mahogany and leather, the kind of room designed to make visitors feel small. He offered me a drink, scotch, the good stuff, and got straight to business. Walt, I'll be frank with you. Universal owns Oswald. I own the distribution rights. You work for me. His voice was matter of fact, like he was discussing the weather. The animators you've been training, most of them have already signed with me directly. Better money, more security. The scotch turned to ash in my mouth. I set the glass down carefully, fighting to keep my hands steady. What are you saying, Charles? I'm saying you can stay on as director, 15% pay cut, but steady work, or you can walk away with nothing. He leaned back in his chair, utterly relaxed. Your choice. I walked. The train ride home stretched like a prison sentence. Kansas wheat fields, Colorado mountains, the desert, all of it blurred past while I sat in my compartment, sketching. Anger has a way of focusing the mind, and mine kept returning to the same basic truth. Never again would I let someone else own what I created. Somewhere between Denver and Los Angeles, Mortimer Mouse took shape on paper. Round ears, button nose, but something indefinably different from Felix or Oswald. This one would be mine, completely,
legally, forever mine. I was still calling him Mortimer when Lillian joined me for dinner in the dining car. Mortimer? She wrinkled her nose at the sketch. Sounds too fancy. How about Mickey? Mickey. The name fit like a glove. Simple and friendly and somehow eternal. I spent the rest of the journey developing his personality. Scrappy but optimistic, clever without being mean-spirited. Everything Oswald was, but owned by me outright. Roy was waiting at Union Station, his face grim. Word had already reached Los Angeles about the defections. Half our staff had jumped ship. We were back where we'd started 4 years earlier. Broke, betrayed, but still standing. "What do we do now?" Roy asked as we walked to his Ford. I showed him the sketches. We build something they can never take away. Mickey's first shorts were silent, competent but unremarkable. The character had charm, but so did a dozen other cartoon figures flickering across screens that summer. What we needed was an edge, something to cut through the noise. Sound pictures were still a novelty. Warner Brothers had scored a hit with The Jazz Singer the year before, but animation with synchronized sound remained uncharted territory. "It'll cost us," Roy warned when I outlined the plan. 4, maybe 5,000 for recording, mixing, the whole works. That's half our cash on hand. I knew the numbers, but sitting in theaters around Los Angeles, watching audiences react to sound films, I could feel the future shifting beneath our feet. Silent pictures were already starting to feel quaint, old-fashioned. We could play it safe with Mickey silent shorts, or we could bet everything on being first to market with something new. "Book the studio time," I told Roy. "We're making Steamboat Willie." The recording session was controlled chaos. Eitworks and I had worked out every sound effect, every musical cue, timing it to the animation with stopwatch precision. The steamboat's whistle, sharp and proud. Mickey using a goat's udders as bagpipes. The xylophone gag where he turns various animals into musical instruments. Each sound had to hit its mark perfectly or the illusion would crumble. November 18th, 1928, the Colony Theater on Broadway, that same stretch of Manhattan where Mintz had tried to bury me. 7 minutes of Mickey Mouse with synchronized sound, playing before the main feature. I stood in the back, watching faces in the flickering light, and felt something shift in the room the moment that steamboat whistle hit. Laughter, but deeper than that, surprise, delight, the recognition that they were seeing something genuinely new. The distributor from Celebrity Pictures found me during intermission, practically vibrating with excitement. "How many more can you deliver? How many do you want?" The money followed quickly after that. Theaters across the country clamoring for Mickey Mouse shorts, merchandising inquiries flooding our tiny office. Roy hired an accountant just to keep track of the revenue streams. By Christmas, we were producing a Mickey short every month, each one grossing more than our entire Alice series had in a year. But success brought its own pressures. Other studios scrambled to add sound to their cartoon series. Felix got a voice. Oswald, my stolen rabbit, started talking too. The technical innovation that had given us our edge was already becoming standard practice. We'd have to find other ways to stay ahead. Late one night, working alone in the Hyperion studio while Los Angeles slept around us, I sketched new characters, new stories, new worlds. The garage on Kingswell felt like a lifetime ago, though only 4 years had passed. We'd survived bankruptcy, betrayal, and our own ambitions. Mickey had saved us, but he was just the beginning. Outside my window, the city glittered with electric light and possibility. Oil wells and orange groves, movie palaces and bungalow courts, all of it sprawling towards the ocean under an endless sky. This place had nearly broken us, but it had also made us. Somewhere out there, kids were falling asleep to Mickey Mouse bedtime stories, and that thought filled me with something approaching wonder. The future spread before us like unmarked territory, and for the first time since that humiliation in Mintz's office, I felt ready to claim it. The sound of coins hitting the bottom of a metal bucket, that's what I remember most from 1929.
Not the crash itself, though I felt that too, but the Mickey Mouse merchandise rolling off production lines like silver dollars into Kay Cayman's careful hands. While bread lines stretched around city blocks and men in good suits sold apples on street corners, children clutched Mickey dolls tighter than their parents held on to hope. I'd learned something crucial by then. Characters don't just live on screen, they live in pockets, on wrists, in bedrooms. Mickey wasn't just a mouse anymore, he was a companion. Roy handled the numbers, as always. Walt, he'd say, sliding receipts across my desk, the licensing brought in more than the theatrical run. I'd nod, but my mind was already elsewhere, chasing the next impossible thing. That's how it was between us. Roy grounded what I dreamed up, and I kept dreaming because someone was watching the ledger. Kay Cayman understood the game better than either of us really. Small man with sharp eyes and an East Coast hustle that cut through our California optimism like a knife through butter. He'd walk into department stores, Macy's, Marshall Field's, and negotiate Mickey sections like he was selling real estate, which, in a way, he was. Mr. Disney, he told me one afternoon in 1932, his voice carrying that Brooklyn accent that made everything sound like a deal. We're not selling toys, we're selling membership. He was right. A Mickey Mouse watch didn't just tell time, it told the world you belonged to something cheerful, something that refused to quit. The Ingersoll watch became our gold mine. $1.50 retail, and we took maybe 15 cents per unit. Doesn't sound like much until Kay moves 2.5 million of them. I'd walk through downtown Los Angeles and see them on wrists everywhere. Kids, adults, even bankers who'd lost everything but still needed to smile for their remaining customers. But watches and dolls were just the beginning. What really changed everything was color. I remember the first time we ran 3-strip Technicolor through the camera. Flowers and trees seemed like a simple enough subject. Roy worried about the cost. Technicolor charged 50% more than black and white, and we were already stretched thin. But when those first frames came back from the lab, all emerald leaves and ruby roses, I knew we'd crossed into different territory. The Academy agreed. First cartoon to win an Oscar, 1932. I stood on that stage at the Ambassador Hotel, holding the statuette, and realized we weren't just making entertainment anymore. We were making art that happened to entertain. The Silly Symphonies series became my laboratory. No Mickey, no recurring characters, just music and movement and whatever story the orchestra suggested. I'd sit with the composers, first Carl Stalling, later others, and we'd build entire worlds around a melody. The Old Mill, Musicland, each one an experiment in how much emotion you could pack into 7 minutes. But 7 minutes wasn't enough, not for what was building in my head. I can pinpoint the exact moment Snow White stopped being a crazy idea and became inevitable. December 34, at my house on Lyric Avenue. I'd gathered the key animators, Ham Lusky, Bill Teitla, the core group, and acted out the entire story. All of it. Every scene, every character voice, every emotional beat. I was Snow White singing to the dwarfs. I was the queen transforming. I was the huntsman's conflicted conscience. By the time I finished, 3 hours later, my shirt was soaked through and the room was dead silent. Then Teitla spoke up. Let's make it. The industry thought we'd lost our minds. Disney's folly, they called it. 83 minutes of animation? Features were for live actors, not drawings. Cartoons were novelties, appetizers before the real show. Who'd sit still for an hour and 20 minutes of sketches moving around? Everyone had an opinion. Charlie Chaplin pulled me aside at a party in Beverly Hills. "Walt," he said, that precise voice of his cutting through the cocktail chatter, "timing is everything. in comedy, in drama, in life. If your Snow White breathes wrong, if she pauses a beat too long, the whole thing collapses. He wasn't trying to discourage me. Charlie understood better than most what it meant to bet everything on an audience's willingness to believe. The money became terrifying quickly. We'd budgeted $500,000. By early 1936, we were approaching $1 million with no end in sight. I mortgaged the studio, mortgaged my house, even borrowed against my life insurance. Roy's hair went grayer by the month. The Bank of America meetings became weekly rituals, then daily ones. A.P. Giannini kept extending our credit, but even he had limits. Walt, he told me during one particularly grim session, I believe in Mickey Mouse. I believe in you, but my board believes in collateral, and yours is running thin. I left that meeting knowing we had maybe 6 weeks before the whole thing collapsed. The pressure did strange things to my mind. I'd developed what I called plussing, the need to make every scene better, every movement more convincing, every background richer. A scene would be finished, approved, ready to ship, and I'd see one gesture that could be improved. Plus it, I'd tell the animators, knowing full well we didn't have time or budget for perfection. But perfection was the only thing that would work. If Snow White looked artificial, if the dwarfs felt like cartoons instead of characters, if the Queen's transformation seemed silly instead of terrifying, we'd lose everything. Not just money, credibility. The chance to prove animation could carry real stories, real emotions. The multiplane camera nearly killed us financially. $70,000 for a machine that could move painted backgrounds at different speeds, creating an illusion of depth that nobody'd seen before. Roy practically had a stroke when I approved it, but I'd seen what it could do. That forest chase where branches whipped past Snow White at different speeds, creating terror through pure visual technique, and I knew we needed it. By summer 1937, we were weeks from insolvency. The picture was essentially finished, but RKO Radio Pictures, our distributor, wanted 20 minutes cut. They had their reasons: double features, theater scheduling, the usual business concerns that treated art like inventory. I locked myself in my office for 3 days. Didn't shave, barely ate, just smoked cigarettes and ran the footage over and over. Roy paced outside, fielding calls from creditors and banks and theater owners. The whole studio held its breath. When I emerged, I'd made my decision. 83 minutes, not a frame less. If we were going down, we'd go down with the story intact. Walt, Roy pleaded, we can always restore the footage later. Let them have their 20 minutes. No, I said, and I think it was the first time I'd ever been that definitive with my brother. If we compromise the story to save the business, we won't have a business worth saving. December 21st, 1937, Carthy Circle Theater. I stood at the back during the premiere, too nervous to sit. The audience was Hollywood royalty, Gable, Garbo, Chaplin again, but also regular folks who'd heard something special was happening. The first few minutes felt tentative. Animated features were uncharted territory. Nobody knew how to watch one. But then Snow White started singing I'm Wishin', and I felt something shift in the theater. The audience leaned forward. They were listening to her voice, believing in her loneliness, caring whether she'd find happiness. By the time the dwarfs appeared, each one a distinct personality, each one moving and talking like a real person trapped in a cartoon body, the theater was completely still. When Snow White bit the apple, I heard someone gasp. When the prince's kiss woke her, the applause started slowly, then built into something I'd never experienced. Standing ovation. 5 minutes of clapping and cheering from an audience that had just watched 83 minutes of drawings and believed every second. The box office confirmed what the applause suggested. $8 million in the first release, more than any animated anything had ever earned, more than most live-action features. We'd proved that animation could be art, that characters could be companions, that impossible things were just things nobody'd figured out how to make possible yet. I kept one of the reviews from that week. Disney has created something genuinely new under the sun, it said. Animation as legitimate drama. Reading it now, I think about all those nights when I thought we'd lost everything, when the mortgage payments loomed and the critics sharpened their knives for Disney's folly. Turns out, it's kind of fun to do the impossible, especially when impossible pays the bills. The money from Snow White changed everything, though not in ways I'd expected. By spring of 1938, after the distributor took their cut and we'd paid down debts, I found myself worth something close to $1 million on paper. Roy showed me the figures one morning in his office, the sunlight streaming through Venetian blinds onto columns of numbers that still seemed unreal. "We did it, Walt," he said, but his voice carried caution. He'd learned not to celebrate too early. I remember walking the Hyperion lot that afternoon, watching our army of artists bent over their drawing boards. 1,200 people now depended on what we built here. The success should have felt like vindication, but instead it pressed against my chest like a weight. Snow White had proven animation could be prestige, could be art, but that only raised the stakes for what came next. Pinocchio was already deep into production, and every frame demanded perfection. The blue fairy's hair alone took weeks to get right, each strand catching light like spun silver. When Ham Lusk showed me the test footage, I made him do it again and again. The costs mounted, $2.5 million by the time we wrapped, but I couldn't accept anything less than what I saw in my mind. The world outside our gates was darkening. Hitler had taken Austria, then Czechoslovakia. By September of 1939, when we were deep into Fantasia production, Poland had fallen and Europe was at war. Our foreign distribution, 40% of our revenue, began drying up like a creek in drought. The numbers Roy brought me grew grimmer each month. Fantasia premiered in November of 1940 at the Broadway Theater in New York. I'd envisioned something revolutionary, animation elevated to concert hall respectability, Mickey Mouse conducting Dukas while classical music washed over audiences through our new Fantasound system. Leopold Stokowski and I had spent months perfecting the marriage of image and symphony. But the public didn't understand what we'd made. Too experimental, the critics said, too long, too expensive to install the special sound equipment most theaters couldn't afford anyway. The failure stung deeper than lost money. We'd created something beautiful, something that pushed the boundaries of what animation could be, and the world seemed to shrug. RKO, our distributor, grew cold. The war had made people hungry for escape, not art. They wanted Mickey and Donald, not Bach and Beethoven. By early 1941, the studio was bleeding cash. We'd moved to our new Burbank facility the year before, 51 acres of modern buildings and manicured lawns that now felt like an albatross around our necks. Dumbo had to be made on the cheap, the budget slashed to $800,000. Even Bambi, years in development, got pushed back as we scrambled to stay solvent. Then came the strike. I still remember the morning it started, May 29, 1941. I arrived to the studio to find picket lines at our gates, men I'd worked with for years holding signs that read "Disney unfair to organized labor."
Art Babbitt, one of our finest animators, led the charge. The man who'd brought Geppetto to life now stood outside our walls, shouting about wages and working conditions. The betrayal cut deeper than any business loss. These weren't factory workers in some steel mill. These were artists, craftsmen I'd nurtured and trained. We'd built something together through the Depression, created magic while the rest of the country struggled, and this was my reward? Nearly 300 of them walked out, leaving their drawing boards empty, their work unfinished. I refused to negotiate. You don't bargain with ingrates and agitators, I told Roy. Some of these men had to be communists. There was no other explanation for turning against a company that had made them prosperous during the worst economic times in American history. The federal mediators kept calling, insisting we had to recognize their Screen Cartoonists Guild, but I wouldn't bend. The strike dragged through that summer like a fever that wouldn't break. Every morning I'd drive through those picket lines, past faces I'd once known, past friends who now saw me as the enemy. The newspapers made it worse, photographers capturing the standoff like it was some grand battle between capital and labor. Inside the studio, those who'd stayed worked under a cloud of tension. Outside, the protesters chanted and marched while Pinkerton guards watched from the shadows. September brought the government settlement we couldn't avoid. The National Labor Relations Board forced our hand. Recognize the union, adjust the pay scales, take back the strikers. I signed the papers because I had no choice. But something fundamental broke that summer. The family feeling we'd cultivated since the early days was gone, replaced by suspicion and formal contracts. That's when I began my correspondence with J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI director understood the communist threat in Hollywood better than anyone, and I wanted to know who I could trust. If there were agitators in my studio, if there were people working to undermine American values through our pictures, I needed to know. Some called it informing. I called it patriotism. Pearl Harbor changed everything again. December 7th, 1941. I was at home when Roy called with the news. By the next morning, Army Air Corps officers were at our Burbank gates, requisitioning half our studio for military training film production. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same facility the strikers had protested was now serving America's war effort. The government contract saved us. $4.5 million over 3 years for training films, propaganda shorts, military insignia designs. The margins were thin, but they kept us afloat while we rebuilt. I threw myself into the work. Der Fuhrer's face, education for death, pictures that showed Americans what we were fighting against. Donald Duck in Nazi Germany, Hitler as a buffoon, democracy as our greatest strength. The war years blurred together in a haze of rationed gasoline and blackout curtains. Los Angeles became a defense boom town, aircraft factories working all clock, military convoys rolling down Sunset Boulevard. At the studio, we carpooled to save gas and grew victory gardens in the spaces between buildings. The cafeteria served meatless meals twice a week, and employees bought war bonds through payroll deduction. Bambi finally reached theaters in August of 1942. Felix Salten's story of a young deer learning to navigate a dangerous world felt different in wartime. Less childhood innocence, more preparation for harsh realities. The fire sequence, where Bambi and his mother flee the burning forest, seemed to echo the newsreels from London during the Blitz. But audiences weren't ready for tragedy,
even beautifully animated tragedy. They wanted hope, escape, laughter. So we gave them compilation features, Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros, cheaper productions that could be made quickly while the expensive features waited for better times. Donald Duck touring Latin America as part of Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. Entertainment with a purpose, art that served diplomacy. The Time magazine cover in May of 1944 helped restore my reputation. Genius at work, they called me, the man who'd brought animation to artistic heights while serving his country in wartime. The story repositioned the strike as ancient history, a minor bump on the road to greater achievements. Uncle Walt, they were beginning to call me, the avuncular creator of childhood wonder. But I knew what that cover story didn't say. The strike had changed me permanently. I'd learned that employees, no matter how well treated, could turn against you if someone whispered the right promises in their ears. I'd learned that talent without loyalty was dangerous, that artistic communities could be infiltrated and corrupted. The paternal feeling I'd once had for my staff had hardened into something more calculating. I would take care of them, but I would never again trust them completely. By 1945, with victory in both theaters of war, I was worth perhaps $8 million. The studio owned its Burbank property outright. Our character merchandising brought steady revenue, and the government contracts had proven there were markets beyond theatrical animation. But most of my wealth remained tied up in Disney stock, in the company Roy and I had built from nothing. The Depression trauma still shaped my thinking. Keep most assets in what you can control. Maintain enough cash for emergencies. Never let others hold the keys to your survival. I'd learned that lesson with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, learned it again during the strike, learned it every time a distributor or exhibitor held our fate in their hands. Standing in my office that spring, looking out over the San Fernando Valley stretching toward the mountains, I could see suburbs rising where orange groves had stood just years before. America was changing, growing, becoming something new in the post-war world. Families would want entertainment, escape, places to take their children and remember what they'd fought to preserve. The war had ended, and with it the certainty that had carried us through those years of training films and propaganda shorts. I found myself standing in a studio that felt too familiar, too small somehow. The animators were back from overseas, some of them anyway, and the ones who'd stayed carried scars from the strike that nobody talked about directly. But you could feel it in the hallways, in the way conversations stopped when I walked by. Roy came to me one Tuesday morning in late '46 with numbers that told a story I didn't want to hear. Animation was expensive, more expensive than it had ever been, and the audiences that had packed theaters during the war were staying home now, buying television sets and washing machines and all those things they'd put off for 4 years. "We need to think differently, Walt," he said, spreading ledger pages across my desk like a dealer laying out cards. "Live action costs a third of what animation runs us." I studied those figures, but my mind wandered to something else entirely. The previous weekend, I'd taken Diane and Sharon to Griffith Park. They wanted to ride the carousel, that old Spillman engineering piece with the painted horses and the calliope music that played the same waltz over and over. I'd sat on a bench with the other fathers, watching our children go round and round while we just sat there, waiting. The carousel was beautiful in its way, but everything around it felt tired. Peanut shells on the ground, paint peeling from the fence rails, a man with tobacco-stained fingers taking tickets and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The other parents seemed bored, almost resentful of the time they were spending there. "What if parents could ride too?" I asked Roy, though we weren't talking about carousels anymore. "What?" "Nothing. You're right about the live action." We started small. Song of the South mixed animation with real actors, and while it gave the critics plenty to argue about, it showed me something about efficiency, about reaching audiences through multiple doors at once. But it was television that really changed everything. Most of the studio heads were treating television like a disease, something that might go away if they ignored it long enough. But I'd sit in my office some evenings, sketching, and I could hear the blue glow of TV sets flickering behind the windows of houses in Burbank. Families gathered around those little screens, sharing stories together in their own living rooms. In the spring of '48, I started carrying a small notebook, just sketching ideas for something I was calling Mickey Mouse Park. 8 acres across from the studio. Maybe a little train that could carry visitors from one themed area to another. Western town, fairy tale castle, something about tomorrow. People thought I was losing my mind. "Who's going to drive to Burbank to see a park?" Roy asked when I showed him the early sketches. But I kept thinking about those parents on the benches, about wasted time, about stories that brought people together instead of keeping them apart. The real breakthrough came in '52 when I decided to form WED Enterprises, Walter Elias Disney, my own company separate from the studio. I borrowed $100,000 against my life insurance policy, telling Lillian it was for design work, which was true enough, but really it was about control. See, I'd learned something from losing Oswald all those years ago. If you don't own the mechanism that creates value, someone else will decide how that value gets used. Roy was skeptical about the park. The board would have been terrified. But if I owned the design and development myself, I could license it back to them, or not.
The insurance company paperwork felt strange in my hands, trading death benefits for cash flow. But I wasn't planning on dying anytime soon, and the money would let me hire the kind of people who could turn sketches into blueprints. By then, the park had grown in my imagination, not 8 acres in Burbank, but something destination scale. I started driving around Orange County, looking at orange groves and thinking about freeways. Anaheim had possibilities: flat land, good highway access, far enough from Los Angeles to feel special, but close enough for families to drive there on weekends. The breakthrough came when Leonard Goldenson called from ABC. They were the third network, struggling to compete with CBS and NBC, and they needed content that would bring families to television sets on weeknight evenings. What if television wasn't the enemy? I asked Roy after that first conversation. What do you mean? What if it was advertising, free advertising that reached every home in America once a week? The deal we struck with ABC was elegant. They'd invest $4.5 million in the park, equity plus loan guarantees, and in return, we'd produce a weekly television show, 1 hour, every Wednesday night, 7:30 to 8:30, right in the heart of family viewing time. But here's what made it beautiful. The show would be about the park, about the stories and characters that lived there. Every episode would be part travelogue, part preview, part invitation. We'd call it Disneyland, and we'd make it feel like viewers were getting advance glimpses of something magical that they could visit in person. I started appearing on camera myself, which felt awkward at first, standing in front of maps and architectural models, talking directly to families in their living rooms, explaining how stories could become places you could walk through and touch and experience with your whole body. The line that seemed to work best was simple. You know, it was all started by a mouse. That connected everything. The struggles in Kansas City, the breakthrough with Mickey, the features, the war years, and now this new thing we were building in Anaheim. One story, one through line, one reason for families to trust us with their Saturday afternoons and their vacation dollars. The train helped me think. I'd built the Carrollwood Pacific in my backyard, a 1/8 scale railroad that ran for almost half a mile through tunnels and over trestles. working on it in the evenings, running the locomotive while Lillian tended her garden. I could feel how pacing worked, how long it took for anticipation to build, when to reveal something wonderful, and when to let riders wonder what might be coming next. People called it a hobby, but really, it was research.
By 53, the television show was bringing in mail from all over the country. Families writing to ask when the park would open, where they should stay when they visit it, what they should see first. And we were still just breaking ground in Anaheim, still figuring out how to build a castle that would look right from all angles, still working out the logistics of moving thousands of people through themed experiences without breaking the illusion. But something had shifted. The strike was behind us. The war was behind us. Animation would always be part of what we did, but it wasn't the only thing anymore. We were becoming something new, a company that could tell stories through movies, through television, through places you could visit, through toys and books and things that lived in your house and reminded you of the stories, even when you weren't watching or visiting. Roy still worried about the money. Every week he'd come to me with new cost overruns from Anaheim, new complications, new risks. But I could see it now, the whole system working together. The television show would advertise the park would advertise the movies would create new characters who could star in new shows and live in new sections of the park, everything feeding everything else, growing larger and more self-sustaining each year. On quiet Sunday mornings, I'd walk through the Anaheim construction site before the crews arrived. Orange trees still stood in some sections, waiting to be cleared for Tomorrowland. The smell of sawdust and fresh concrete mixed with the sweet scent of citrus blossoms. Bulldozers and steamrollers sat idle, waiting for Monday. But I could see it finished. Families walking down Main Street toward the castle. Children's faces lit up with recognition and possibility. Parents rediscovering their own sense of wonder. Stories made physical, made shareable, made real. We'd learned to make television work for us instead of against us. We'd figured out how to turn each medium into promotion for all the others. And we'd kept control of the most important piece, the creative process itself. The mouse had indeed started it all, but this was something new. The morning of July 17th, 1955, I woke before dawn with my stomach twisted in knots. 4:30 in the morning, and I was already dressed, pacing the Holmby Hills house while Lillian slept. In a few hours, the whole world would be watching. 90 million people, they told me, as we opened the gates to Disneyland. I'd mortgaged everything for this. $17 million sunk into what the papers called Walt's folly. Orange groves bulldozed, the Magic Kingdom built on borrowed time and borrowed money. Roy had warned me the numbers were getting scary, but I knew something he didn't. I'd walked those 160 acres at midnight, seen the Sleeping Beauty castle lit pink against the California sky, heard the steam whistle echo across empty pathways. It wasn't folly, it was home. The phone rang at 5. Bad news travels fast, and this morning brought a parade of it. The asphalt in Fantasyland was still soft. We'd poured it yesterday in 100-degree heat. The plumbers were on strike, which meant I had to choose drinking fountains or toilets. I picked toilets. Let people buy Coca-Cola. Nobody wants to clean up the other mess. Then came the counterfeit tickets, thousands of them flooding the gates like a broken dam. We'd printed 11,000 invitations for press and VIP families. By 8 in the morning, 28,000 people were pushing through the turnstiles. Kids climbing over fences, adults shoving past bewildered ushers. I watched from my apartment above the firehouse on Main Street, and for a moment, just a moment, I wondered if I'd built a monster instead of a dream. But the cameras were rolling,
ABC had their crews positioned everywhere, ready to broadcast live across the country. This wasn't just an opening day anymore, it was television. And television, I'd learned, doesn't care about your problems. It only cares about your performance. I straightened my tie, walked down to Main Street, and did what I do best. I told a story. To all who come to this happy place, welcome, I said into the microphone, looking directly into the camera lens. Behind me, chaos. The Mark Twain riverboat was so overloaded it nearly capsized. Dumbo had broken down, with screaming children trapped in the pink elephants. Gas leaked somewhere in Fantasyland, forcing us to rope off half the rides. I talked about dreams instead, about the magic of imagination, the power of believing. When a reporter mentioned the broken attractions, I smiled and said, "Well, that's all part of the adventure, isn't it?" The camera loved it, the audience loved it, and slowly, impossibly, the day started working. By afternoon, the initial panic had smoothed into something resembling order. Families wandered Main Street buying ice cream and souvenirs. Children rode the carousel, their laughter mixing with the calliope music. The chaos hadn't disappeared, it had transformed into energy, excitement, the kind of barely controlled magic I'd been chasing my whole life. That first year, we pulled in nearly 1 million visitors. A family of 4 spent about $25, admission, food, rides, a Mickey Mouse hat or two. The margins were beautiful once we got the kinks worked out. 40% profit after we paid for labor, maintenance, and Roy's endless worry about the books. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was psychological. I'd proven something that night in 1954 when I couldn't sleep, sketching plans by lamplight in my den. Americans didn't just want entertainment, they wanted someplace that felt safe, controlled, perfect. A place where Main Street had no horse manure, where pirates were friendly, where tomorrow looked bright and shiny as a new Chevrolet.
The television show helped sell the dream. Walt Disney Presents put me in 20 million living rooms every week, standing beside my desk or strolling through the park, explaining upcoming attractions in my best avuncular voice. The producers wanted me to wear suits, but I preferred cardigans. Softer, more like the uncle you actually wanted to visit. Edward R. Murrow came to the house in 1956 for Person to Person. He wanted to film my railroad in the backyard, the Carrollwood Pacific, my miniature passenger line that ran through Lillian's flower beds. I spent an hour showing him the controls, explaining how the signals worked, why I'd built a tunnel under the driveway. The cameras captured me operating the locomotive, this grown man playing with an elaborate toy. But it wasn't play, it was research. Every curve of track, every grade crossing, every station stop, I was learning how to move people through space, how to control their experience, make them feel wonder instead of worry. The Backyard Railroad was Disneyland's prototype, and Disneyland was something bigger still. I'd started a company called Retlaw Enterprises, Walter spelled backward, Lillian's idea, to handle the pieces that didn't fit neatly into the studio structure. Retlaw owned the Disneyland Railroad, the monorail we built in 1959, even the licensing rights to my own name. It generated steady income, kept me independent from the corporate machinery that Roy loved and I found suffocating. The money was getting serious now. The 1957 stock offering valued the studio at $40 million. Our family stake was worth maybe $14 million on paper, though I tried not to think about it in those terms. Numbers made me nervous. I preferred to think about what we could build next. Not everything worked. Sleeping Beauty nearly broke us. 8 years and $6 million for a film that barely made its money back. Audiences weren't ready for that level of artistic ambition, or maybe they just preferred our live-action pictures. Pollyanna and The Absent-Minded Professor were cheaper to make and easier to sell. Animation was becoming a prestige business, not a profitable one. but the park kept growing. 5 million visitors by 1960, money flowing in faster than we could count it. The moat wasn't just geography anymore, it was imagination. Nobody else had Mickey Mouse. Nobody else had that combination of technical precision and emotional manipulation that made a simple boat ride through singing dolls feel like the most important 20 minutes of a child's life. Late at night, when the park was empty and the cleanup crews had gone home, I'd walk the pathways alone, smoking too much, thinking too much, planning the next expansion. The Matterhorn was under construction, a steel mountain rising from the Fantasyland skyline. We were adding submarines to Tomorrowland, pirates to New Orleans Square. Each addition made the place more complex, more expensive, more perfect. I think that's when I understood what we'd really built. Not just an amusement park, but a machine for manufacturing happiness. Every detail controlled, every emotion calculated, every memory carefully crafted to sell more memories. It was capitalism disguised as childhood, commerce dressed up as wonder. And it was working beautifully. The Uncle Walt persona wasn't entirely false. I did believe in the magic we were creating, but it wasn't entirely true either. Behind the cardigan and the gentle smile was someone who obsessed over every detail, who fired employees for having dirty fingernails, who watched the crowds through hidden cameras to see which attractions pulled them in and which let them down. By 1960, I was worth maybe $30 million, though the exact number shifted depending on the stock price and how you valued the park. But wealth wasn't the point anymore. Control was the point. The ability to build worlds exactly as I imagined them, to make reality conform to vision instead of the other way around. Standing in my apartment above the firehouse, watching the last visitors file out through the Main Street gates, I could see the future spreading out like a map. More parks, better technology, larger dreams. We'd figured out how to bottle childhood and sell it by the gallon. Now we just had to decide how big the bottle could get. The night air smelled like cotton candy and fresh paint, the soundtrack of my success. Tomorrow there would be new problems, new crises, new opportunities to perform calm while chaos swirled around me. But tonight, for just a moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Perfect, profitable, and completely under control. The Florida land stretched before me like a blank canvas, 27,000 acres of swamp and citrus groves that most folks would have called worthless. But I saw something else entirely. Standing there in 1963 with Roy beside me, watching the morning mist rise off those wetlands, I knew we'd found our second kingdom. "You sure about this, Walt?" Roy asked, swatting at a mosquito. He was always the practical one, my brother. Had to be, I suppose, with me chasing dreams the way other men chase rabbits. I lit another Marlboro and took a long drag. Dead sure. The cigarette tasted bitter in the humid air, but I couldn't seem to quit the damn things. 3 packs a day by then, sometimes more when the pressure mounted. Look at it, Roy. No motels crowding our gates, no cheap hamburger stands ruining the magic. We control everything this time. The secret was in the shell companies. Latin American Development and Management Corporation. Had a nice official ring to it, didn't it? Nobody in Central Florida suspected that Walt Disney was buying up their backwater at $180 an acre. If they'd known, the price would have tripled overnight. But anonymity was my friend in those days. Always had been, really. I remember driving those country roads with our advance men, windows down, studying every grove and farmstead. The state was still Old South then. Segregated lunch counters, colored bathrooms, the whole ugly business that we'd have to navigate carefully. Disney couldn't afford to take sides publicly.
not with our family brand. But privately, I knew what was coming. The Civil Rights Act was inevitable, and we'd be ready for it. Integration through economics, not politics. Make the experience so magical that prejudice became irrelevant. By 1965, we owned more land than some small countries. 27,000 acres purchased through dummy corporations for roughly $5 million. Roy nearly had a heart attack when I told him the scope of it, but I'd learned from Disneyland's mistakes. In Anaheim, we'd built our castle and watched entrepreneurs throw up cheap motels right at our doorstep. Never again. The Florida press conference that October was pure theater. I stood before those reporters, my voice steady despite the excitement bubbling underneath, and revealed what we'd been planning. Disney World, I called it then. Later it would become Walt Disney World, though I wouldn't live to see Roy make that change. But the real vision wasn't just another theme park. That came later, in 1966, when I filmed my pitch for Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. I can still feel that studio lighting on my face as I explained my grandest dream to the camera. A city of 20,000 residents, all living in perfect harmony under Disney's benevolent guidance. Climate-controlled, crime-free, corporate-managed. Imagine a community where the latest technology serves the everyday needs of families, I told the lens, my hands moving to illustrate the radial design. Central business district, residential zones, monorails connecting everything. No slums, no social problems that couldn't be engineered away. Just good, clean American living under a glass dome. Lillian thought I'd lost my mind. "Walt, honey," she said one evening as I sketched dome designs at the kitchen table, "people aren't going to want Disney running their city council." "Why not?" I asked, not looking up from my drawings. "We run a better operation than most governments I've seen." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Because they're not employees, Walt, they're citizens." I stubbed out my cigarette and reached for another. The distinction felt academic to me then. Good management was good management, whether you were running a studio or a city. But Lillian understood something about human nature that I was still learning. People wanted the illusion of freedom, even if they couldn't handle the responsibility that came with it. The audio animatronics breakthroughs kept my mind occupied when the Epcot planning got frustrating. Iworks and the boys had outdone themselves with Mr. Lincoln for the 1964 World's Fair. Standing in that IBM pavilion, watching our mechanical president deliver the Gettysburg Address, I felt the same thrill I'd experienced when Mickey first spoke in Steamboat Willie. Technology serving story, engineering in service of emotion. The fair itself was America at its most optimistic. Flushing meadows looked like the future, steel and glass pavilions reflecting that massive unisphere. Families in their Sunday best, riding monorails between exhibits. Our It's a Small World attraction drew lines around the block. 300 singing dolls in native costumes, all proclaiming the brotherhood of man in 17 languages. Pepsi paid for the whole thing, and we made it into something that would outlive us all. Roy and I walked through the crowds one evening after closing, past the empty pavilions and silent fountains. "You realize what we've done here, don't you?" I asked him. "Made Pepsi a lot of money?" I laughed, but there was more to it. "We've turned corporations into storytellers. Ford, General Electric, IBM, they're all using our methods now, making their products into characters, their innovations into adventures. Roy nodded slowly. He understood the business implications better than anyone. We weren't just in the entertainment industry anymore. We were in the experience industry, teaching America how to package dreams for mass consumption. The sale of WED Enterprises to the studio in 1965 formalized what had been true for years. Everything flowed through the Disney brand now. $3.8 million in stock, plus ongoing royalties for the use of my name and likeness. It sounds calculated when I put it that way, but it wasn't about the money, not entirely. It was about ensuring continuity, making sure the vision would survive even if I didn't, which turned out to be prescient considering what the doctors found in November of 1966. Lung cancer, Dr. Morrison said, not meeting my eyes. Left lung. Will need to operate immediately. I sat in that sterile office, still tasting the Marlboro I'd finished in the parking lot, and thought about all those cigarettes I'd drawn Mickey smoking in the early cartoons. Seemed fitting somehow. The habit that had helped me think through countless story problems was finally demanding its payment. The surgery went well enough. They removed the whole lung, patched me up, and sent me home to recover. But I couldn't stop working, couldn't stop dreaming. From my hospital bed, I sketched Epcot transportation systems and calculated attendance projections for Disney World's opening day. Roy kept telling me to rest, but rest felt like surrender.
My desk in those final weeks looked like the command center of a man at war with time. Red pencils scattered across Epcot blueprints. A scale model of Sleeping Beauty Castle I'd been refining for the Florida project. Family photos, Linian looking elegant as always, Diane and Sharon smiling from their wedding days. My Irving Thalberg Award from 1942, back when the industry still believed in producer-driven storytelling. And always, always, that pack of Marlboros within reach. Lillian found me there on the morning of December 15th, slumped over the plans for Epcot's transportation hub. Heart had simply stopped, the doctors said later. Too much strain on a system weakened by surgery and 3 decades of 3-pack days. But in those final moments, I wasn't thinking about failure or loss. I was thinking about legacy, about the Cal Arts campus that would rise from my $15 million bequest, training the next generation of storytellers, about the Florida project that Roy would complete without me, proving that the Disney magic was bigger than any one man. Most of all, I was thinking about control. Not the petty control of a tyrant, but the loving control of a gardener. Every character, every park, every experience carefully tended to ensure that families could trust us with their most precious commodity, their time together. The will I'd signed months earlier would divide my estate simply. 45% to Lillian, 45% to our daughters, 10% to charities led by Cal Arts. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just the accumulated value of a lifetime spent converting imagination into property, dreams into dividends. Roy would rename the Florida project Walt Disney World, though I never asked him to. He'd postpone his retirement to see it through, dying himself just months after the Magic Kingdom's gates opened in 1971. The company would struggle for years to find its creative footing without us, but the infrastructure would hold, the characters would endure, the parks would multiply across continents. And somewhere in Glendale, at a modest grave marker in Forest Lawn, my ashes would rest beside Flora's,
while the empire we'd built together continued its patient conquest of childhood wonder worldwide. The Florida swampland I'd bought for $5 million would be worth 10 times that by 1970. But the real return on investment wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the millions of families who would walk through those gates seeking the same thing I'd been chasing since that first drawing of a mouse. A place where magic felt as real as money, and dreams came with a lifetime guarantee.